Recording. Welcome, Eric. Welcome to the St. Louis Press Club's Hour in the Now online series. And today is July 23rd, 2020. Would you give your name and your title, and we'll go from there.
Great. Thanks, Jessica. My name's Eric Berger. I'm an editor, or I'm associate editor at the St. Louis Jewish Light and freelance writer.
Okay. You know, I have to think back, of course, since we're doing this series on COVID and then the overlay of civil unrest in our community. You wrote an opinion piece when the pandemic was pretty certain, it was here and it was beginning its devastation. So can you reflect on your opinion piece at that time, give a little background on it, and then let's revisit it today?
Yeah, well, I think it was pretty widely known that the newspaper industry was not particularly healthy even before the pandemic started, with the exception of really, I would say, just two national papers in the Washington Post and the New York Times. Seemed like all other newspapers were struggling, and I just had the sense that the pandemic might be the tipping point for newspapers that maybe were already on the verge of closing, or maybe of discontinuing the print edition and moving strictly online. So I think what I said was that this is kind of our last best shot, because maybe if people were given kind of the threat that everyone felt like they were facing by the pandemic, I think I kind of felt like people would be following the news more closely. So you would have that on one end, and simultaneously newspapers would have a harder time sustaining themselves, because newspapers rely on advertising, and when businesses lose money, the first thing to go is oftentimes advertising. So I thought that maybe people would come to see the value of newspapers at the same time as they were struggling, and then feel more of a desire to support local newspapers.
So what is your opinion today, several months down the track?
Well, I have to admit, I haven't seen, I don't know if there have been huge layoffs, or I imagine there have been. Of course there have been layoffs. I don't know if newspapers, like if the rate of layoffs has actually increased since the pandemic started as compared to before, because like I said, there were already a lot of layoffs happening. I guess there have been some unexpected bright spots, like pretty soon after kind of the lockdown orders were put into place. The Riverfront Times laid off a lot of its staff, but then pretty quickly they started a fundraising campaign in order to be able to keep their print edition alive. And at least as far as I know, I think they've printed every week during the pandemic. And so that, to me, I write some for them, and I think they do a lot of good work. So I was happy to see that. But I don't know that necessarily like what my kind of dream for what might have happened with the pandemic, with kind of this, surge in support for local newspapers, has actually taken place.
Mm-hmm. So this fundraising effort, really, there are so many GoFundMe efforts, et cetera, but when you see something like that happen for a particular publication, how does that make you feel?
To see a fundraising effort, well, I kind of have, my main job is at the Jewish Light, and we are a nonprofit, so we rely on people donating. And I tend to think that because I said that the New York Times and the Washington Post were kind of the only two healthy newspapers, and that's true. But then also, I think a lot of NPR affiliates have managed to do well these last couple of years, as far as fundraising goes. And so I tend to think that maybe the future for newspapers is the nonprofit model. And so when I see a fundraising campaign like that, I think, maybe that's the right approach. Like, I think the Guardian had been a for-profit newspaper. I could be wrong, but then they shifted to a nonprofit model. And I think that somehow, people are, they look at donating to a nonprofit differently than they might look at, paying for a subscription. There's something that maybe feels better to people about that.
Do you think people appreciate the fact that they have to pay for something that's an online presence? I mean, you hear a lot of people say, why should I pay for it? It's online.
Right. Yeah, no, and I think that's still there. But I have to say, I have heard more people talk about, oh yeah, I'm subscribing online. It's only $1 a week, or it's only, $10 a month, or whatever it is. And it is really pretty darn cheap. And so when it's such a minimal cost, I don't think people have, that people have a problem with paying $1 a week. I mean, obviously there are still plenty of people, but they are interested enough in a newspaper to not want to have to be blocked by like a paywall where, okay, once you've read your 4 articles or whatever it is a month, you can no longer read it. So they're willing to pay, a small amount each month. But I don't know if that is enough to actually support a paper. I don't know if the combination of that and digital advertising is enough to support newspapers the way that print advertising and print subscriptions used to.
Mm-hmm. Well, so many models for journalism. Many have failed. They're the constant experiment. The evolution of the models for how journalism will survive. So I think certainly it's a connection with the audience. You wrote you're writing for the Riverfront Times. You've written for the Washington Post. You've written for St. Louis Magazine. You've got, as a young journalist, we still call you relatively young journalist. You've spread your good work in various places. What are the kinds of stories that attract you? What do you pitch?
Yeah, I can get excited about really any topic. If I feel like what I'm doing is original and something that is, revealing something new to the world, and that is a story that people will care about, I can get interested and excited about anything from sports to politics to food to stuff happening in the nonprofit world to small business stuff. And, I always say, even though now I've been doing Jewish journalism for more than 8 years, even working for a Jewish paper, you end up covering a lot of different sectors because there's a lot of different intersections between, the Jewish religion and other parts of society. So, I still, even for just the Light, I end up covering politics and, like I said, all the various things that I just listed. So I've really never had, I don't feel like I've ever had like a specific beat, So I think I can get excited about, like I said, any topic. I would say I most enjoy like the sorts of stories where I can really spend a long time on it, and kind of something that's a little more investigative in nature, where I'm doing a lot of research and talking to a lot of different people, and end up hopefully producing a story that kind of has some significant weight to it. Mm-hmm. Those are the things that I get most excited about, I would say.
The wonderful story that you did about the transportation issues of people having to take public transportation to get to their employment, and the trials associated with that and all the other issues. So I think, if I recall right, I think Tony Messenger actually gave you a compliment on that story.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Yeah.
That was pretty cool. I'm sure that made you feel good as a.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it was, I felt good about that story, and the feedback I got was very nice. So
again, that story speaks to maybe a story that might have been done by the bigger paper, but because of economics and workforce being what it is, you fill the need there. You fill the community need. So that was kind of cool. You talked about Jewish journalism. So how does that differ from regular journalism?
Yeah. I don't like the structure of the stories. I don't think is any different. My editor, Ellen Futterman, she was at the Post-Dispatch, I think, for more than 25 years. And I think she would probably say that, the work she does now is just as valuable as the stuff she did at the Post-Dispatch, or, maybe more valuable. But I think it's just a matter of the topics being a little different. Maybe you're a little closer to your subjects because, not that everyone who, about half our staff isn't Jewish, but, it's St. Louis, the Jewish community, I think there's 60,000 people here. So you kind of end up interacting with a lot of the same people. So, I think you end up knowing a lot of people that you're talking to, and you kind of, you get feedback from people maybe more than you would if you were working for like a larger metro paper. I think maybe it feels a little bit more personal in nature.
But the journalism, essentially, your skill set works.
Yeah. I would say I don't approach stories for the light any differently than I approach stories for any publication. I always say I try to tell a story as completely as possible so that, people from various political, from various points of view and various ideologies can sit there and say, well, he told this story fairly.
Balanced.
Yeah.
Balance is not always the operative, of course.
Right.
But,
right.
So in the context of COVID-19 and then the civil unrest, how did the Jewish Light treat this crisis?
Well, one thing that I think we can be proud of is, again, my editor, Ellen Futterman, she did a story like at the very beginning when a number of people connected to Temple Israel got infected with the Temple Israel preschool got infected with the coronavirus, and a family, like a husband, wife, and their kids all got it. And the husband and wife were sick enough to where they ended up, I think, in the intensive care unit. She was the first person to report on that, and then that story ended up getting picked up not only by other local publications, but also by national news organizations and the Today Show. So that was cool to see a paper our size kind of be the, it always feels good to kind of get the scoop and be the first people on a story. And so, I think we've tried to do a mix of things. I mean, I don't think anyone is looking to us for medical updates, as far as like numbers of people like who have become sick with the virus. I think what we've done has tended to be kind of more features, just about the various ways in which people in the Jewish community are being affected by it. So, we've like recently we did this story on just kind of how Jewish day schools are preparing for reopening and maybe ways in which it's different for them rather than for a public school trying to reopen. What else have we done?
What about the civil unrest that I addressed earlier? Might you like to comment on that? Were you out there covering any stories with regard to Black Lives Matter and the Jewish community? Because there's often the talk that the Jewish community and the African American community are often partners in discussing social justice issues.
Right. So yeah, I mean, I did cover some of the protests for the Washington Post. For the Light, I didn't cover any of the protests, but we did. I'm sorry, I know we did stories, but they're not always top of mind because sometimes I'm juggling so many different stories, and once you're done with it, kind of you move on to the next thing, and then you have to have people sometimes remind you of what specific stories you did.
No need to apologize. That's actually nice to hear that you're doing lots of stories.
Yeah. But we certainly, we certainly have done a fair amount of reporting about the intersection between the African American community, Jewish community, and Jews of color. I think Ellen and I teamed up and we did some reporting on, we did a story on how rabbis were responding to the kind of swell of support for the Black Lives Matter movement in the wake of George Floyd being killed, and just how they were, striking that balance between wanting their members of their congregation to stay safe, but also kind of that feeling that need because of their faith to try and, kind of the phrase that gets used a lot, tikkun olam, to repair the world, to try to better the world, and just that call to action, try to help people. So we did a story on that and interviewed Rabbi Susan Talvey of Central Reform Congregation and Rabbi Andrea Goldstein of Shara Emeth, and
so the faith community.
Right, and I think what was interesting was I think what kind of prompted that story is we saw more rabbis attending protests and just kind of being more vocal about their support for the Black Lives Matter movement, because I think we saw a lot of new people come out to protest this time around as compared to 2014 after Michael Brown was killed, and other kind of high profile police shootings of unarmed Black people.
So when you're having your meetings of the day with Ellen Butterman, I guess COVID is still up there in terms of, might we cover something this week, in that context? I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I'm wondering what those meetings look like. Do other news stories get left behind because this is a great importance right now and meets a community need.
Right. Yeah, no, we're always looking for new ways to cover it. And to be honest, sometimes it can be a little bit challenging just because there is, like, life has slowed down significantly, and so there is just kind of less going on, sometimes, and we don't always, we cover a lot of positive developments, and positive developments are sometimes around, what artists are doing or what, nonprofits are doing, and there's just less of people getting together in person, so there's a little bit less to cover in that regard. But yeah, we are always looking for ways in which to cover how the pandemic is affecting the Jewish community. This week I've been talking with some teens about, how they're feeling about going back to school and, participating in sports or seeing their friends. And I'm not quite sure what we're going to do with that yet. I think sometimes, it's good as a journalist just to kind of be having conversations with people, even if you don't necessarily have a clear outline of a story in mind. Sometimes it's good to kind of go on a fishing expedition, I think.
Do you associate with other journalists in town?
Yeah.
What are those conversations like? Excuse me.
I do have to admit, and I said I do, but I have to admit, Jessica, I don't spend a ton of time. My main way of, I guess, interacting with other journalists is just seeing what they're doing. I definitely listen to the local NPR affiliate and read stories from Post-Dispatch reporters and, read the Riverfront Times stuff in St. Louis Magazine. So it's more I see what their work is, but I'm not someone who's like particularly active on Twitter interacting with other journalists. And I honestly, I don't spend a ton of time talking with other journalists.
But you read, I know you said you read a lot.
Yeah.
Which is important.
Right. Yeah, no, I think you have to kind of stay apprised of what's going on, because sometimes, that sparks ideas for ways you can follow up on a story.
So not too long ago, you graduated from Mizzou. You've got your Bachelor of Journalism, your BJ, and what you learned then, would you have ever imagined these kinds of, crises coming down your path? Or on the other hand, maybe you were well prepared for that. You tell me.
No, I don't think I never imagined living through a time like this. I just, I've said a number of times, I was fortunate to, I think most people my age here in America, obviously tons of people have had personal struggles, but kind of on a macro level, we were fortunate to never have to go through anything like this. We never had to live through a time where there was the country was, where there was a draft, where you had to worry about being drafted to go off and fight in the war. I've never had to worry about having enough food, so this is really the first kind of big, there have been other things like the financial recession of 2008 or, 9/11, but those didn't really kind of dramatically change my life the way this has. And so, when I was graduating journalism school, I don't think I necessarily had a clear vision. I knew I wanted to be a print journalist, but I don't think I wasn't so concerned about, what it was I would be covering. I think I've always been pretty flexible as to like what my beat would be or what topics I would write about.
But you have the foundational skills that have been refined certainly over these years. You left with good skills and you're using them. How would you agree?
Yeah, no, I've certainly, I've gotten, I mean, I know for sure that I'm a better journalist now than I was when I graduated. And, that's due in large part to just, some of it has to do with just quantity. The more you do anything, the better at it you get. But it's also like advice I've gotten from older journalists and just tips I've gotten. And, in the editing process, sometimes other journalists notice habits, that you don't notice yourself, and so that feedback can help you kind of refine your skills.
Age and experience and this whole world of convergence, certainly. I see you're doing podcasts now, and you're online. You started out, in the print world, so
right.
Really spread your wings, certainly. So that's good.
Yeah.
What do you see happening in the near future with regard to our community and journalism as you're seeing it, and having to do with this pandemic and really a social conscience awakening, I think.
Right.
Or
right.
real.
Yeah. I don't know. There's so much that there's so much that is out of our control. We don't know what's going to happen as far as a vaccine, how long it's going to take for there to be a vaccine. We don't know how effective a vaccine is going to be. We don't know what's going to happen in the November election. And so I think a lot depends on, if I were to identify like what the two big question marks are, I would say the November election and, how quickly we can get an effective vaccine. But as far as journalism goes, I do, like I said earlier, I do have this suspicion that newspapers will end up, more and more newspapers will move to a nonprofit model, or, new news organizations will pop up and fill the void of that was left by newspapers that have either, are either a shell of their former selves or have gone under entirely. There's kind of there's programs that I've started in the last couple of years that are encouraging. There's a program, an organization called, I think it's called Reporting for America or Reporters for America, which is kind of similar to Teach for America, where people go into communities where I think into quote unquote news deserts and report on their, recent college graduates, the same way people go into teach in underserved school districts. And so, I think if you get more people to buy into the importance of journalism, then hopefully the newspaper industry will become healthier. And I guess then the other big question mark as far as the future of news is, kind of the shift we're seeing, or just kind of the uncertainty that we're seeing at places like the New York Times and the Washington Post, as far as what are the bounds of acceptable opinion pieces. I think there have been a lot of questions in recent months as to, are certain views that could previously be expressed at papers like the Times and the Washington Post no longer acceptable. And I'm not passing any judgment, saying that that's right or wrong, but I think there is kind of that uncertainty there as to what's going to happen as far as newspapers and kind of the ideas of objectivity.
Mhm. I think it's evolving. I think we're looking at new lexing, an examination across the board in terms of how journalism, how the craft is performed. So, well, we appreciate your time, Eric.
Oh,
It's
sorry, it's breaking
been
up.
very nice to talk with you and appreciate the time that you gave us today on behalf of the St. Louis Press Club. Thank you for your time and all good wishes for you personally. Stay safe and good luck with all the journalism you do.
Thanks very much, Jessica. Sorry.
Thank you for being a part of the local, giving something to the local community, because that localism is very important.
Right. And thank you. I don't know if you can hear me clearly. It was breaking up a little bit. But anyways, thank you to the Press Club and for everything that you do as far as your work on promoting media literacy, which I also think is very important. I think that also is going to be what the future is going to depend on, is having people be educated news consumers and be able to discern fact from fiction. And so I think that's also very important work. So thank you for what you're doing in that regard.
Well, that was nice of you to mention that, because it is important. Thank you, Eric.
All right, Jessica.
Have a good
Bye.